It was December of 1887, and the northern gale had started to shriek across the Dakota plains, sounding like a pack of 1,000 starving wolves. Outdoors, the mercury had plummeted to a bitter 40 degrees below zero. Livestock perished right where they stood, turning to ice in their very tracks. Timber dwellings groaned under the strain, feeling as though they might shatter at any moment. Yet, right in the center of this snowy purgatory, tucked away in a shelter that locals had dubbed a lunatic's tomb, a 16-year-old widow rested peacefully beneath 3 feet of dirt and prairie grass. She was Elara Brennan, and what follows is the tale of how sheer humility and ancient knowledge triumphed over arrogance and the grip of death itself. However, to fully grasp the miracle of that night, we need to rewind half a year to a June afternoon, when Elara first stepped foot in the territory, with every worldly possession she owned stuffed into a single canvas sack. She had lost her husband a mere 3 weeks after their wedding day. Henrik, her Norwegian carpenter groom, met his end during a tragic accident deep within the coal mines of Pennsylvania. She had no relatives left. Her pockets were entirely empty. All she possessed was a crumpled piece of mail guaranteeing free acreage out west for anyone brave enough to stake a claim. Here was a lonely 16-year-old girl bearing the delicate hands of someone who had never once plowed a field. As Elara stepped off the train car in the settlement of Millerton, the local men stared at her, their expressions caught somewhere between pity and sheer amusement. The land agent, a heavy-set fellow who went by Captain Osborne, flat out warned her that a delicate thing like her wouldn't survive a single month out there. He even proposed refunding her travel fare if she would just give up on the spot. Nevertheless, Elara carried something inside her that the captain was blind to. She held on to the memory of her grandfather Lars, an elderly Swedish miner, who, when she was just 8, taught her about how the Vikings endured the brutal northern winters by carving homes right into the hillsides, utilizing the earth itself as a barrier against the freezing chill. Elara picked out her homestead far from the main town, right alongside Willow Creek, choosing a spot with a gentle slope facing straight south. The moment the surrounding settlers caught wind of her intentions, the gossip spread like a wildfire. Thomas Carver, the wealthiest individual in the area, boasting a herd of 300 cattle and a 2-story residence outfitted with genuine glass windows, chuckled so hard he actually choked on his whiskey. He loudly proclaimed that burrowing into the dirt was a habit for wild beasts, certainly not for decent Christian folks. In his view, a proper dwelling required timber walls, an expensive iron stove shipped from back east, and a roof visible from miles away to prove you actually mattered in this life. The minister's wife, Margaret Whitfield, a woman as frail as a reed, but armed with a voice sharp as a blade, declared it an absolute disgrace for a young woman lacking male supervision to attempt such nonsense. She called the whole endeavor terribly unnatural. According to her, the Lord designed women to bake and mend clothes, not to go digging around like blind moles. Margaret extended an offer for the girl to work as a domestic servant at the parsonage, scrubbing floors in exchange for room, board, and a meager $2 a month. Elara nodded her head in polite appreciation, yet firmly turned the offer down. She desperately needed her own shelter before the freezing season set in, and the harsh Dakota winter was known to wait for absolutely no one. Her third detractor was John MacLeod, a Scottish Civil War veteran who fancied himself the most seasoned frontiersman in the entire territory. Having made it through 5 brutal cold seasons, he constantly bragged about his survival methods. Upon hearing about Elara's scheme, he rode out to her claim specifically to issue a warning. He told her point blank that he had witnessed grown, sturdy men freeze to death simply because they didn't respect the dropping temperatures. A subterranean dwelling, he insisted, would just soak up moisture and quickly turn into a muddy grave. He swore that the only legitimate way to stay alive was to secure thick lumber, build a towering chimney, and stockpile 20 cords of seasoned firewood well before October rolled around. MacLeod volunteered to sell her building materials on credit. suggesting she could work off the debt at his farm once spring arrived. Elara absorbed every single sentence respectfully, holding his gaze, and proceeded to deliver a response that MacLeod would never forget for as long as he lived. Speaking in her halting English, carrying a distinct Irish lilt, she replied, "My granddad taught me that the dirt doesn't deceive you. The ground holds on to the summer's warmth and gives it right back when the frost hits. I am not trying to impress a single soul. My only goal is to stay alive." MacLeod just shook his head in disbelief and rode off. That very evening, down at the local saloon, the trio of Carver, Whitfield, and MacLeod actually placed bets that the Brennan girl wouldn't even make it to Christmas Day. They figured by November she would either be begging for a spot next to their hearths or lying dead beneath the snowdrifts. But Elara tuned out their judgments. She had a massive task ahead of her, and every time the sun rose, it meant one less day to prepare for the deep freeze. If you agree that the wisdom of our ancestors carries more weight than modern arrogance, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are dedicated to reviving the forgotten tales that history tried so hard to erase. On her very first morning, Elara staked out her boundaries using wooden pegs and some twine. She outlined a rectangular space measuring 12 feet in width and 16 feet in depth, planned to be hollowed out directly into that south-facing hillside. The positioning was far from an accident. Her grandfather had made it clear that the winter sunlight, though feeble, consistently shines from the south. Having a front wall designed to catch those rays, even if only for a couple of hours daily, could literally mean the difference between perishing and surviving. She initiated the digging process utilizing a borrowed shovel, acquired from the town blacksmith in exchange for mending his torn shirt. The June dirt remained fairly yielding, softened by the recent spring showers. She shoveled tirelessly from the moment dawn broke until the evening shadows made it impossible to see her own fingers. Every single scoop of earth felt like a brutal negotiation with her own physical limits. Those delicate hands, previously accustomed to nothing harsher than needlework and scrubbing dishware, broke out in nasty blisters on day one. By the second afternoon, those blisters had burst open. Come the third day, rough calluses finally started taking shape. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire. Her spine turned into a tightly coiled rope that felt ready to snap. After dark, she would sleep on the bare ground right beside her muddy trench, cocooned in a woolen blanket and resting her head on her canvas sack. Her meals consisted of a chunk of stale bread washed down with cold creek water. Since there was not a soul around to witness her tears, she simply refused to cry. There was a job that needed getting done. By the time June drew to a close, she had excavated 4 feet straight back into the embankment. All the dirt she removed was meticulously piled up along the flanks of her site. That soil wasn't just waste material, it was meant to be her upcoming roof. Come early July, she managed to hit the 6-foot depth mark. Down inside that pit, even with the blistering summer sun beating down above, the ambient temperature felt roughly 10 degrees cooler. The surrounding dirt behaved just like an enormous sponge, soaking in the daytime heat and gradually releasing it once night fell. This exact mechanism, which today's engineers refer to as thermal mass, was thoroughly understood by our ancestors long before anyone bothered to coin a fancy term for it. Now approached the most crucial phase of the build: constructing the roof. Elara trekked 2 miles up the river to a small grove of cottonwoods, locating sturdy saplings that measured about 4 inches across and 8 feet in length. Wielding a borrowed hatchet, she chopped down 20 solid beams. She possessed neither a draft horse nor a wagon to haul them. Therefore, she dragged every single log individually, looping a rope around them and hauling with her entire body weight, fighting uphill back to her campsite. A single round trip required 3 agonizing hours, 20 separate journeys, 60 total hours of pure dragging. Her palms began to bleed all over again, but once she finally finished, she had 24 perfectly lined up poles just waiting to be installed. She laid the timbers horizontally across her dugout space, making sure to leave a gap at the entrance for a doorway and a tiny crack near the back to allow for airflow. These wooden supports rested right on the tightly packed earth forming the side walls. There was no hardware involved. She certainly couldn't afford to buy nails. Following that, she wove flexible willow branches across the beams, lacing them together to form a sturdy mesh layer. This netting was designed to keep the loose soil from sifting down through the ceiling gaps. And this is where the real ingenuity happened. Directly over the willow branches, Elara started stacking thick sod, blocks of native prairie grass sliced into chunks that were roughly 3 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and 2 feet in length. Each piece of turf weighed anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds. The dense root system of the prairie grass bound the soil together like a naturally woven fabric. She arranged 3 distinct layers of these sod bricks, alternating the direction of the roots to lock them tight, ultimately forming a roof just about 10 inches thick. This overhead barrier wasn't merely a pile of loose dirt. It remained a living, breathing organism. Those roots would continue to sprout and tangle even tighter, forging a completely waterproof seal. Once the winter arrived and the flurries began, the accumulating snow would serve as an extra blanket of insulation. A 2-foot drift resting on top of her shelter would provide the equivalent thermal protection of another 12 inches of solid cover. The underlying physics was incredibly basic, yet ruthlessly effective. For the exterior front wall, Elara took her remaining cottonwood logs and stood them up side by side, erecting a solid timber barricade. Into every single gap, crack, and finger-wide space between those vertical poles, she forcefully jammed a thick paste made of mud and dried grass. Once that clay dried out, it would harden into an airtight barrier. She fashioned a crude door out of scrap lumber she scrounged up by the creek, left behind from some busted pioneer wagon. A strip of tough leather served as the hinge. For a handle, she simply used a curved piece of wood. By the time mid-August rolled around, her dugout, this subterranean cabin, was fully finished. The grand total for the project came out to $12. $8 went toward purchasing that used hatchet from the blacksmith, which she got to keep permanently. The other $4 paid for a handful of nails, utilized exclusively for the entryway, and to construct a crude bed frame out of leftover branches. Her entire inventory of belongings could be summed up quite briefly. A single blanket, a thin straw mattress, 1 knife, a spoon, a fork, a cooking pot, a pair of tin plates, a trio of books, and her late mother's old kerosene lantern. She assembled a rudimentary hearth using river rocks and wet clay, crafting a tiny firebox tucked into the back corner, complete with a stovepipe made from a rusty tin can packed with mud that vented right through a meticulously carved hole in the ceiling. The draft worked perfectly. The toxic smoke funneled right out. And then, something truly remarkable occurred. Because the little fireplace was hugged by solid dirt on 3 sides, the generated warmth didn't just instantly vanish straight up the chimney. Instead, it first soaked directly into the earthen walls, which functioned exactly like thermal batteries, hoarding the heat and slowly radiating it back into the room for hours after the embers died out. Right as Elara was putting the finishing touches on her hidden sanctuary, the folks nearby were busy erecting massive monuments to their own vanity. Thomas Carver put up a brand-new double-story barn utilizing premium lumber hauled all the way from Minnesota. He dropped a whopping $120 on the boards alone. John McLeod expanded his property, tacking on an entirely new room outfitted with glass window panes. That set him back $80. The Whitfields actually hired 3 laborers to construct a dedicated woodshed featuring a shingled roof, a $50 expense. Every single one of them discussed their winterizing efforts as if they were participating in some grand contest, arguing over who possessed the largest stack of firewood, debating who owned the most massive iron stove, bragging about whose walls were the thickest. Not a single person bothered checking in on Elara. Everyone just figured she had already packed up and fled. or was shivering in some borrowed shack, simply waiting for her inevitable demise. And honestly, in a certain sense, they weren't entirely wrong. Elara had indeed vanished from sight, yet she hadn't run away. She had just seamlessly merged with the landscape itself. September rolled around, bringing the initial frosty mornings. The foliage on the cottonwood trees shifted to a brilliant gold and fluttered to the ground like scattered coins. The prairie grass withered and faded to the dull shade of aged honey. Flocks of migrating birds headed south in massive formations that practically blotted out the sunlight. Mother Nature was shutting things down, bracing herself for the ultimate brutal test. Elara spent the entirety of September patching every microscopic gap on her timber wall with extra helpings of mud and straw. She foraged for wild berries and carefully dehydrated them. She even dug out a tiny cellar pit right inside her subterranean home, where the climate hovered just a hair above freezing, the ideal environment for stockpiling potatoes and carrots, which she earned from the local grocer after sewing him a heavy quilt. By late September, an event unfolded that would shift the entire dynamic. The supposedly seasoned Scotsman, John MacLeod, happened to be riding his horse near the creek bed when he noticed a wisp of smoke rising directly out of the hill. It was a faint, nearly transparent trail of exhaust, escaping from what looked like the solid ground. Intrigued, he wandered closer and stumbled right upon Elara's entryway. He knocked on the timber. Elara swung the door open. MacLeod froze right there on the threshold, completely dumbfounded by what greeted him. The interior was incredibly warm. It wasn't the harsh, bone-dry roasting of an overstuffed metal furnace, but rather a gentle, embracing coziness, reminiscent of the mid-May sunshine. The climate was absolutely perfect, hovering right around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the outdoors was already threatening to freeze. There wasn't a single draft to be felt. The air wasn't damp in the slightest. Her floor consisted of creek gravel, perfectly leveled and bone-dry. The earthen walls felt incredibly solid and hard-packed, mimicking the texture of real adobe. Natural illumination spilled in through the cracked door and a tiny glass window pane that Elara had purchased with her final 50 cents, carefully mounted into the timber facade. And yet the most baffling detail of all, there was virtually no smoke indoors. That little hearth was burning with such incredible efficiency, utilizing so little fuel, that it barely generated any toxic exhaust at all. The Scotsman questioned her on exactly how much timber she was currently burning. Elara simply gestured toward her small fuel pile. It amounted to perhaps a quarter of a cord, consisting mainly of wood scraps, snapped twigs, and dried buffalo chips. MacLeod himself had already hoarded a full 20 cords to keep his 4-person household alive. He calculated that he'd have to incinerate roughly a quarter cord every single week once the deep winter hit. Elara was stretching that exact same amount over an entire 30 days. He demanded to know how such a feat was even possible, and the young woman, speaking softly in her halting English, laid it out for him. The soil hangs on to the warmth. I am not trying to combat the freezing temperatures. I just step back and let the earth handle the heavy lifting. MacLeod shook his head again, though this time he wasn't mocking her. He was just genuinely bewildered. The concept seemed far too basic and way too unconventional. It simply couldn't be legitimate. He said his goodbyes and departed, opting to keep everything he had just witnessed a complete secret. Because confessing what he saw would mean confronting the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his own methods were deeply flawed. The month of October ushered in the initial snow flurries, gentle flakes that blanketed the terrain like a pale sheet, only to melt away entirely by noon. The local homesteaders started firing up their large stoves on a daily basis. The rate at which they were burning through firewood rapidly increased. Thomas Carver actually started panicking that 24 cords might not cut it. He ended up buying 10 extra cords at a severely inflated price from a traveling merchant heading southbound. Once night fell, households huddled tightly around their metal heaters, draping heavy blankets over their shivering shoulders, forced to watch their timber walls sweat condensation that eventually turned to ice right in the corners of the room. The youngsters developed nasty coughs. Bitter drafts snuck in through every single architectural flaw. The wooden floorboards grew so incredibly frigid that nobody dared to walk around without thick socks. Inside Elara's dugout, none of this misery was taking place. During the evenings, she would flip through one of her 3 novels by the glow of her kerosene lamp, lounging upon her straw bed, completely barefoot and perfectly comfortable. Her indoor climate hovered steadily between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, entirely unaffected by whatever chaos was brewing outdoors. Whenever she did spark a blaze, a tiny one, meant solely for an hour at twilight to prep meals and boil water, the ambient temperature would climb up to 65, and it would plateau right there for a substantial amount of time. The sheer thermal mass provided by the tons of packed dirt enveloping her shelter absorbed that energy and bled it back into the space at a snail's pace throughout the entire night. The setup functioned just like an oven running in reverse. It wasn't baking her. It was merely keeping her cozy. November served as the initial real-world trial. Temperatures plummeted to a harsh 10 below zero for 3 consecutive evenings. Back in the settlement, the plumbing lines froze solid. Pitchers of milk turned into blocks of ice right on the countertops. The livestock quivered violently inside their wooden stalls. John McLeod was shoving logs into his fire all hours of the day, yet his exhales still materialized into frosty white clouds right inside his own living room. His wife came down with a severe case of pneumonia. A physician had to ride over from the adjacent town, demanding a $5 fee just to look at her. McLeod dropped another $3 on medical supplies. That was an $8 hit in just 7 days, and there were still 4 agonizing months of winter left on the calendar. Thomas Carver soon realized that his stunning, towering new barn was essentially acting as a colossal wind tunnel. Freezing gusts penetrated every seam in the siding, literally sucking the warmth right out of his adjoining farmhouse through the shared wall. He was forced to hire 2 laborers just to caulk those gaps using tar and straw. A $20 mistake. By the time the patching was done, the barn was indeed airtight. Yet his 4 prized horses were now inhaling stagnant, damp air, thick with their own exhaust, which quickly led to respiratory infections. One of the animals perished. That equaled a devastating $40 financial blow. Arrogance proved to be incredibly expensive when the snow flies. All the while, Elara continued residing in her quiet subterranean world. The surface might have been turning into a solid block of ice, but inside her dugout, absolute tranquility reigned. Her indoor climate was so incredibly dependable that she could map out her chores without a single worry about the impending weather. There was 0 sense of rushing. Panic simply didn't exist. She incinerated nothing more than a handful of dried manure each evening. Her diet consisted of roasted potatoes and a loaf of bread she baked weekly inside her tiny clay hearth. She drank directly from the creek whenever it ran free and simply melted down snow caps once it froze over. Her total living expenses for the month of November, exactly $0. Once early December hit, the Reverend's wife, Margaret Whitfield, finally paid her a visit. She didn't come out of kindness, but rather driven by an incredibly morbid sense of curiosity. She fully anticipated discovering a filthy, desperate young girl surviving like a wild beast trapped in a muddy hole. The reality she walked into left her utterly speechless. When Elara unlatched the door, a wave of heated air washed out like a comforting sigh. Margaret stepped over the threshold, and for the first time in several weeks, her body finally stopped shivering. She actually peeled off her thick shawl. She glanced around the interior. The earthen walls were immaculate. The gravel floor was freshly swept. The space carried a scent of pristine soil, reminiscent of a vegetable patch right after a heavy rainstorm. There was absolutely no stench of soot, no dampness in the air, and certainly no trace of misery. Adopting a tone significantly softer than her usual bark, Margaret inquired how the girl had managed such a feat. Elara offered her guest a mug of tea, brewed simply from boiling water and dried peppermint leaves. The pair took seats on a couple of wooden crates that doubled as furniture. Then Elara, completely devoid of arrogance and holding absolutely no desire for petty revenge, broke it down for her. She spoke fondly of her grandfather. She recounted the tales of the Nordic Vikings. She detailed how the bare ground actually serves as the most massive blanket in existence. She was essentially giving a lecture on physics without even realizing she was discussing science. She explained complex thermodynamics without ever having heard the actual terminology. She touched upon thermal mass and temperature gradients, noting how 3 feet of packed dirt equates to a solid 12 inches of lumber regarding insulation value, but carrying the massive added benefit that the soil actively banks the heat, whereas the timber merely blocks the draft. Margaret sat there and listened, yet the concepts flew right over her head. Or perhaps she simply refused to comprehend them, because actually grasping those truths would require admitting that a completely uneducated 16-year-old orphan had unlocked a survival method that every supposedly seasoned frontiersman in the territory had completely ignored. She bid farewell with a stiff word of thanks and marched right back out into the freezing wind. Later that evening, sitting at their dining table, the Reverend asked his wife if she had checked in on the Brennan girl. Margaret confirmed that she had, admitting the girl was indeed alive and apparently doing fine, but insisted it was purely a stroke of blind luck and nothing more. Just sheer coincidence. And eventually, that lucky streak was bound to run dry. It absolutely had to end, because if her luck held out, it would essentially prove that every single assumption they held regarding survival in the Dakotas was completely backwards, and they couldn't possibly stomach that reality. Arrogance simply refuses to ever admit when it's been playing the fool. Mother Nature, however, holds absolutely no respect for human ego, and she was just about ready to deliver her ultimate, unforgiving lesson. On the 20th of December in 1887, the glass barometer hanging inside the local post office started to plummet. The elderly postmaster, a man who had weathered 3 decades out on the plains, stared at that instrument the way a condemned man watches an executioner sharpen his blade. He muttered under his breath that something wicked was approaching. Something genuinely catastrophic. By the 22nd, the sky had shifted into a bizarre, sickly shade of greenish-gray. The livestock grew visibly agitated. Horses outright refused to step foot outside their stalls. Farm dogs howled at nothing at all. On the morning of December 23rd, the tempest finally slammed into them. And when I say tempest, I am not talking about a run-of-the-mill snowfall. I am referring to a meteorological behemoth that history books would eventually label the Great Blizzard of '87. The gales hit first, sweeping down from the northwest at a staggering 60 miles per hour. That wind did not merely blow. It sliced right through you. It ripped the roofs clean off storage sheds. It flattened sturdy fences. It swept up the snow before it even touched the ground, transforming the flurries into a relentless whip of solid ice. Trailing right behind those gusts came the deep freeze, 40 degrees below zero. Then the actual snow arrived, not gently drifting downward, but rocketing horizontally like pale bullets fired by some phantom firing squad. Within a single hour, visibility dropped to absolute zero. A grown man couldn't even make out his own hand held out right in front of his nose. The roaring of the blizzard grew so deafening that families were forced to scream just to communicate inside their own parlors. And that freezing air. The cold felt like a living entity, an intentional force that hunted for every tiny crack, every exposed gap, every architectural weakness, breaking in like a burglar to siphon away both the warmth and life itself. Thomas Carver and his boys sprinted out to their freshly built barn in a desperate bid to secure their livestock. By the time they crossed the 20 yards from their back door, They had entirely lost the feeling in their fingers. The horses were in a state of absolute terror. The cattle were bellowing loudly. Carver and his sons scrambled frantically to pull the heavy doors shut, but the gale-force winds kept tearing the wood right out of their grasp. Once they finally managed to lock the structure down, they bolted back toward the main house. His youngest boy, who was only 12, started sobbing because his feet had gone completely numb. Carver plopped him down right beside their cast-iron stove, which was roaring away, devouring timber like a starved dragon. Yet the ambient heat utterly failed to reach the corners of the living room. Those beautiful, incredibly expensive timber walls simply lacked the necessary thermal mass. They chilled down instantly. The iron furnace, engineered to heat a room via convection, channeled all the warm air straight up to the ceiling, where it immediately lost its heat against the freezing rafters and sank back down the corners as a frigid draft. Carver incinerated an entire quarter cord of wood on that very first night. A quarter of a cord vanished in just 12 hours. Burning at that speed, his stockpile wouldn't even last until January. Nevertheless, he couldn't afford to stop feeding the flames, because if those embers died out, his entire family would perish. It was as simple and brutal as that. His wife bundled the children up in every single blanket they owned. They slept right on the floorboards, clustered tightly around the iron belly, inhaling soot, hacking their lungs out, their eyes completely bloodshot, yet still breathing. John McLeod didn't fare nearly as well. His brick chimney, constructed using the traditional tall and straight method, morphed into a massive vacuum tunnel for the blizzard. The gales plunged down the flue, snuffing out his fire, flooding the interior with blinding smoke, and then roared right back up, sucking out every last ounce of residual warmth. McLeod desperately tried to block the flue, but that just caused the cabin to fill with poisonous exhaust. His wife, who was still fragile from her bout with pneumonia, started choking violently. McLeod was forced to make an impossible choice: suffocate from the fumes or freeze to death. He opted for the freezing cold. He unblocked the chimney vent. The flames sparked back to life, but the fierce wind continued to thieve away all the heat. He burned through half a cord of lumber that evening. By the dawn of the 24th, his entire winter fuel reserve had been slashed in half, and the blizzard showed absolutely zero signs of letting up. The Whitfield clan, holed up in their parsonage alongside that fancy new woodshed, ran into a completely different disaster. Their heating stove operated flawlessly. Their firewood supply was more than plentiful. But the real issue was the windows. Those gorgeous glass panes that the Reverend claimed let in the Lord's glorious light were now bleeding heat exactly as if they were gaping holes in the wall. The glass panes, boasting an incredibly high thermal conductivity, effectively functioned as vertical sheets of solid ice. Frost materialized right on the interior side of the panes, building up into a frozen layer half an inch thick. The minister nailed heavy quilts over the frames, but the catastrophic heat loss had already occurred. The structure was bleeding warmth much faster than the furnace could possibly replace it. By the afternoon of Christmas Eve, their indoor temperature hovered at a chilling 40 degrees. Come midnight, it had dropped to a freezing 30 degrees Fahrenheit. They too huddled tight against the iron heater, shoving wood into the firebox, praying to the heavens, and violently shaking. Meanwhile, tucked away inside her subterranean cabin, Elara Brennan was fast asleep. She wasn't tossing and turning with anxiety. She wasn't shivering in terror. She rested with the profound peace of someone who understands the vast difference between combating Mother Nature and actually cooperating with her. Up on the surface, the gales continued to shriek at 60 miles an hour. The snowfall piled up into massive 6-foot drifts. The ambient air remained at a lethal minus 40 degrees. Yet absolutely none of that chaos reached Elara. Her dugout was entirely buried beneath the white powder by now, utterly invisible, looking as if a homestead had never even been built there. And those very same snowdrifts, rather than acting as a deadly adversary, had transformed into her greatest ally. 12 solid inches of packed snow provides roughly the same R-value as an inch of modern fiberglass insulation. Elara boasted 2 full feet of powder resting right on top of her sod roof. It was the equivalent of gaining 2 extra inches of premium thermal protection, entirely free of charge, courtesy of the exact same blizzard that was actively trying to kill her neighbors. Down below, her living quarters maintained a cozy 52 degrees. Elara hadn't sparked a single flame in her hearth since the previous afternoon. She simply had no reason to. The massive tons of earth hugging her walls, which had been slowly soaking up energy all autumn long from her tiny daily fires, were now radiating that banked warmth back out. The ground was performing exactly like a colossal thermal radiator, precisely as her Swedish grandfather had promised. The energy transfer from the soil straight into her dugout's interior was incredibly gradual, yet deeply consistent. She lost roughly 2 degrees an hour to the chill, which were immediately offset by a 3-degree influx radiating from the dirt. A net positive thermal balance. While her neighboring settlers waged a desperate war using fire against the ice, Elara was just existing in perfect harmony. She slept a solid 8 hours. She woke up feeling completely refreshed. She dined on some baked bread and a strip of dried jerky. She studied her Bible by the soft glow of her kerosene lamp. She listened to the gales roaring up above, sounding muffled and incredibly distant, much like the fading memory of a terrible nightmare. And she simply waited, because she fully understood what inevitably follows these catastrophic tempests. Forced, undeniable humility. Christmas morning broke with a dead, eerie silence. The howling winds had finally died down. The flurries had ceased their relentless assault. The freezing temperatures, however, lingered, solid and incredibly lethal, 42 degrees below zero. Thomas Carver's prized herd was entirely wiped out. The 13 head of cattle he had left outside, assuming his massive barn was simply too crowded, were frozen solid out in the pen, standing perfectly upright like morbid statues made of meat. A devastating $300 financial loss. His massive stockpile of firewood was running dangerously low. He possessed maybe a week's worth of fuel left, with an agonizing 3 months of winter still looming ahead. His youngest boy had 2 toes turning a sickly black. Severe frostbite. The lad was likely going to lose them. John McLeod was arguably in a much worse predicament. His sick wife literally couldn't muster the strength to rise from her mattress. Her pneumonia had returned with a vengeance, severely worsened by the freezing drafts and the toxic chimney exhaust. McLeod had already incinerated every piece of accessible timber he owned. He still technically possessed 10 cords sitting out in the yard, but they were currently entombed beneath 4 solid feet of packed snow and ice. Attempting to shovel through that frozen mess, lacking proper rest and without a hot meal in his belly, equated to sheer suicide. He recognized that he was down to 2 stark choices: quietly watch his loved ones freeze to death, or finally swallow his massive ego. Reverend Whitfield arrived at that exact same grim realization. His fancy new lumber shed was entirely buried under a drift. His wife and kids were freezing solid. And for the very first time in a lifetime spent delivering sermons condemning the sin of pride, he was actually forced to live out the lesson. He had to confess that he had behaved like an absolute fool. That a 16-year-old girl had grasped a fundamental truth that he, despite all his formal education and worldly experience, had been entirely too arrogant to even entertain. It was the Scotsman, McLeod, who broke first. He stumbled out of his freezing cabin, swaddled in every animal pelt he owned, trudging agonizingly through the waist-deep powder, heading straight for the spot where he knew Elara's claim was located. He couldn't actually see the structure. There was absolutely nothing there, just a pristine, blindingly white hillside. Nevertheless, he recalled the exact geographical coordinates. He started hollering at the top of his lungs. Elara Brennan. Elara. I am begging you. I desperately need your help. My poor wife is fading fast. My children are freezing to death. I was completely wrong about you. You were absolutely right. Please!" Deep beneath the snowpack, Elara picked up on a series of muffled thuds. She climbed her earthen interior step, shoved against her timber door, which was entirely obstructed by a drift, shoved with all her might, until her arm punched right through the frozen crust. She clawed her way outward, and standing right there was MacLeod. His face flushed crimson from the brutal exertion, frozen tears glistening in his thick beard. He stared down at her, this hardened military veteran, and muttered something he had never confessed to a single living soul. He told her, "I was a fool. Please save us." And Elara, without uttering a single syllable, simply nodded her head. "Get inside." MacLeod clambered down into the burrow, and the intense wave of heat smacked him directly in the face like a physical blow. His knees instantly buckled beneath him. He nearly collapsed onto the gravel. It felt entirely like stepping through a portal into another universe. Elara handed him a tin cup of boiling water. She instructed him to take a seat, catch his breath, and try to relax. Following that, she ordered him to go back out and fetch his family. To bring every last one of them down here. She insisted there was plenty of room. MacLeod scrambled back to the surface, sprinted over the drifts to his cabin, and reappeared 30 minutes later, hauling his wife bundled up in quilts like an infant, with his 3 tiny children clinging desperately to his heavy coat. The entire clan descended into the subterranean sanctuary, and for the very first instance in over 72 hours, their bodies ceased their violent shivering. Barely an hour later, Thomas Carver showed up. He had spotted the Scotsman making the trek. He simply traced MacLeod's boot prints through the deep snow. He arrived hauling his wife, his 4 kids, and his completely shattered ego. He didn't even bother asking for an invitation. He remained completely silent. He merely locked eyes with Elara, eyes that had just stared the Grim Reaper squarely in the face, and she simply shifted over to create more floor space. That tiny dugout, originally engineered for a single occupant, was now acting as a bunker for 14 souls. It was incredibly cramped. The sleeping arrangements were highly uncomfortable. Yet the air remained blissfully warm. The space was incredibly secure. It was filled with living, breathing people. The Reverend Whitfield was the last to arrive, showing up right around dusk alongside his wife and 2 kids. This very man, who had loudly sermonized against the sheer madness of burrowing into the dirt like wild beasts, was now dropping to his knees inside that exact same hole, literally kissing the earthen floorboards, praising the Almighty for sparing their lives. Elara divvied up her meager rations. She passed around her melted snow water. She generously shared her tiny sanctuary. There wasn't a single ounce of bitterness behind her gaze. There was absolutely no gloating. She simply radiated the quiet dignity of an individual who understands that absolute truth never needs to raise its voice. The group spent 3 full days confined within that earthen bunker. 72 hours of shoulder-to-shoulder crowding, 3 days of hushed conversations, 3 days of youngsters playing quietly on the dirt floor while the surface world remained locked in a frozen nightmare. And throughout that confined period, a profound shift occurred. Carver quietly inquired about the specific mechanics behind her sod roof construction. MacLeod asked for a detailed breakdown of how her tiny firebox operated. The Reverend actually wondered aloud if this architectural method was mentioned anywhere in the good book, prompting Elara to smile and gently quote Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season and a time to build up." Margaret Whitfield, the very woman who had labeled her efforts a sin against nature, pulled the girl into a tight embrace, broke down in tears, and begged for her absolute forgiveness. By the 28th of December, the outdoor thermometer finally climbed back up to a manageable 20 below zero. That was just warm enough for the clustered families to safely trek back to their own properties. They crawled out of the dugout, squinting against the blinding sunlight bouncing off the snowpack, and realized that their entire world had been permanently altered. Roughly half the livestock in the entire territory had been wiped out. Dozens of homesteading families had lost absolutely everything they owned. 3 local men had frozen solid just attempting to cross the yards to their barns. Yet these specific families, these 14 individuals who had endlessly mocked a 16-year-old orphan, were still drawing breath, and they fully recognized that fact. They knew exactly who had orchestrated their salvation and precisely why they were still standing there in the snow. The winter sun ascended into the sky, looking somewhat pale but undeniably present. The massive drifts began an agonizingly slow melt. The frozen carcasses of the cattle would eventually be uncovered over the coming weeks, serving as grim, silent monuments to the incredibly high cost of human arrogance. However, down on the claim-bordering Willow Creek, right on that specific patch of dirt that everybody had dismissed as utterly worthless, a completely new chapter began. Once the spring thaw of 1888 arrived, John McLeod grabbed a shovel and started excavating his very own dugout right behind his timber cabin. He didn't build it to replace his home, but rather as an emergency storm shelter, a functional root cellar, and a monument to the basic common sense he should have possessed all along. Thomas Carver, the wealthiest landowner in the county, hired a pair of laborers not to erect another massive barn, but to carve out a deep subterranean basement right beneath his existing residence, outfitting it with thick stone retaining walls and a heavy sod ceiling, flawlessly mirroring the blueprints Elara had sketched out for him. Reverend Whitfield delivered an Easter Sunday sermon that the local congregation would recount for decades to come. He preached about how the Almighty often dispatches profound teachers in the most surprisingly humble packages. He stressed that genuine wisdom doesn't stem from thick textbooks or advanced age, but rather from a spirit of humility and paying close attention to the natural world. He detailed how an uneducated, penniless immigrant teenager, entirely devoid of a support system, had successfully schooled an entire pioneer community on the massive difference between barely surviving and truly thriving. He issued a deeply public, heartfelt apology to Elara Brennan, prompting the entire packed church to leap to their feet and deliver a roaring ovation. Elara wasn't actually sitting in the pews to witness the tribute. She was back in her earthen bunker, sleeping quite peacefully, having stayed up the entire previous night assisting one of McLeod's heifers through a difficult birth. Fast forward to 1890, and the federal land agent, Captain Osborne, the exact same official who had guaranteed she wouldn't last a single 30-day stretch, personally handed her the official deed to an additional 10 acres of property. It was acreage that had been forfeited by early settlers who simply hadn't made it through the winters. He looked her in the eye and stated, "Miss Brennan, you have proven a concept that I honestly believed was downright impossible. You proved that the frontier isn't a beast meant to be violently conquered. It is an entity that will lovingly embrace you, provided you have the sense to embrace it first. This acreage belongs entirely to you, free of any charge, along with my deepest, most sincere respect." Come 1892, Elara crossed paths with a man named Henrik Johansson, a Norwegian carpenter who had 15 years on her, a fellow widow possessing gentle hands and an incredibly soothing voice. The pair tied the knot that very spring. Working side by side, they erected a modest timber cabin sitting exactly 100 yards away from her original subterranean shelter. However, they adamantly refused to ever fill that hole back in. They preserved the structure, utilizing it as a functional root cellar, keeping it intact as a physical monument to the exact location where the genuine truth first took root. Down in that dirt bunker, they stockpiled their harvests of potatoes, fresh carrots, and hearty turnips. The indoor climate continued to hold completely steady, hovering right around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire calendar year, requiring absolutely zero artificial heating or ice boxes. It remained a triumph of basic physics, so profoundly elegant that it essentially felt like sheer sorcery. Elara and Henrik went on to raise 4 healthy children. Every single one of those infants spent their most vulnerable initial winters tucked away inside that dugout, staying incredibly warm, thoroughly protected, and fully embraced by the packed earth. And once those children reached adulthood and staked out their own homesteads, every last one of them prioritized excavating a subterranean shelter long before they ever bothered framing a single wooden wall. Pure survival wisdom had seamlessly evolved into a family tradition. The community's former mockery had morphed into absolute reverence. By the time the 1890s rolled to a close, sod structures were no longer viewed as backwards or primitive across the Dakota Territory. Locals had rebranded them as thermal sanctuaries, high-mass dwellings, vernacular frontier architecture. Highly educated engineers traveling from the East Coast began rigorously studying these structures, meticulously tracking their indoor climates and calculating their precise R values, ultimately proving that the exact same concepts the ancients understood entirely through pure instinct were now being heavily validated by hard scientific data. 3 solid feet of heavily compacted soil yielded an R value sitting right around 21. A standard 6-inch timber wall offered a measly R value of barely 8. Yet the factor that proved vastly more crucial than standard insulation metrics was the concept of thermal capacitance. The dirt actively banked the heat energy. The lumber absolutely did not. And out in a brutal environment where the mercury could swing a terrifying 60 degrees between noon and midnight, that specific hoarding capability literally defined the razor-thin line separating life from death. Elara managed to live all the way to the ripe old age of 103. She peacefully passed away in 1974, resting in her own mattress, completely surrounded by generations of great-grandchildren, with her original dugout still stubbornly clinging to the hillside, still highly functional, and still locking in that flawless 55-degree climate. Shortly before she drew her final breath, a county historian dropped by the farm to capture her voice on a magnetic audio tape. He explicitly asked the elderly woman to reveal her ultimate secret. He wanted to know how she could have been so incredibly certain that her earthen bunker would succeed when every single seasoned expert in the territory had guaranteed her failure. And she, utilizing her 79-year-old voice, raspy from the passage of decades, yet crystal clear in its message, declared the following: "My granddad always warned me that Mother Nature simply doesn't possess an ego. The natural world only operates on unbreakable laws. If you choose to cooperate with those strict rules, they will gladly work in your favor. If you foolishly try to combat them out of sheer vanity, they will slaughter you without an ounce of mercy. I was never inherently smarter than any of those men. I was simply far more humble." That specific audio cassette remains preserved deep within the Dakota County Historical Archives to this very day. And if you ever sit down to listen to that tape, you can distinctly pick up the sound of the prairie winds howling softly in the background, the exact same gales that slaughtered hundreds of settlers, yet utterly failed to leave a scratch on a teenage girl who grasped one fundamental truth: that the earth beneath our boots is not our adversary. It never has been. It is our ultimate mother, our thickest blanket, and our truest home. And provided we treat the dirt with the respect it deserves, if we actually pay attention to its subtle teachings, and if we are willing to leave our massive egos right at the threshold and enter with genuine humility, that soil will fiercely guard us against the most agonizingly cold temperatures the universe could possibly throw our way. Historical accounts, exactly like the legend of Elara Brennan, serve to remind us that maintaining humility and a keen sense of observation are vastly more valuable than solid gold. They prove that fancy credentials and stacks of cash become nothing more than soggy paper the moment the northern gales start shrieking. They reveal that our grandparents, spinning yarns that often sound like childish fairy tales, are actually reciting highly technical survival manuals forged through centuries of brutal real-world experience. They demonstrate that ancient ancestral wisdom isn't just some form of romantic nostalgia. It is hardcore scientific fact, rigorously peer-reviewed within the most unforgiving laboratory known to mankind. Harsh reality. If this incredible tale of poetic justice managed to strike a chord in your heart, and if you felt, even for a split second, that an alternative lifestyle truly exists, one that remains deeply rooted in the natural world rather than chained to human arrogance, then please smash that like button and share this video with someone who desperately needs to learn that practicing humility does not equate to being weak. It equates to being profoundly wise. It means becoming utterly invincible. It means channeling your inner Elara, that 16-year-old orphan girl who successfully conquered the freezing winter, shattered the local arrogance, and cheated the Grim Reaper himself, armed with absolutely nothing more than a rusted shovel, a childhood memory, and the sheer willpower to finally listen to what the Earth had been attempting to teach us since the dawn of time.